Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for this opportunity to be able to present and share some of the work I've been doing, particularly in view of the theme that we are covering. So my background is in industrial and organizational psychology, and under the branch of the work we do is the element of career psychology, and that's how this paper comes about. And the other things we'll get into as we get into the paper. Um, there's a noted focus globally and locally that we need to pay attention to the context in which our learners and educators are operating within. Now, this context is not necessarily a context which is characterized by an equal playing field. I think the whole notion of equality and access is what was coming out very strongly in our morning session with the keynote and also the comments that were being shared as part of the deliberations. One of the challenges that we are noting, particularly in the work we are doing, particularly in the Eastern Cape and the rural Eastern Cape, and in the context of rural, we also mean the precinct in which the University of Fort Hare is based, which is your Alice community. And then we've got a uniqueness a little bit. We've got a peri-urban setup, which is in Bisho, King Williamstown, and we've got a more urban setup, which will be in East London. So one of the things that we are noticing in all the three contexts is this challenge, particularly amongst high school learners in the enactment of career choices. Particularly, as in line with our theme, students who are coming from what you would call a context of disadvantage, the rurality comes in, but also particularly in the township schools. This challenge has been rooted particularly in where disadvantage features. Professor Murray at the University of Pretoria has got a whole celebrated work around use of narratives in trying to assist in understanding issues related to career decision making. So we need to find a way of safeguarding a passage that allows students, particularly students from context of disadvantage, to learn of other career choices. Now we can go to the how apartheid framing of careers happened, particularly in certain population groups, to say in some communities your aspiration was to be a teacher, a nurse, or a teacher. And particularly interesting in that is then the new generation which is coming up to say, how do we assist them in making and enacting this choice? So we took a passion, particularly in the marine sector, because the Eastern Cape provincial government is developing that particular sector. So call after call exists for players in the particular sector. But what we do notice is that in response to those calls, predominantly we have one university that is making a huge imprint, particularly in the marine economy, which is the Nelson Mandela University. And we are also trying to come up with the other universities to try and come up to say, how do we encourage an appetite towards those career sectors? So we took an interest in that sector because it is important to the lifeblood of the Eastern Cape provincial government. It also becomes important for us to also understand that learners from township schools feature predominantly in this framing of the province. Predominantly, most of the schools are either in the rural context or particularly in the township schools. And we need to understand particularly what exactly is happening in those contexts. So we note the lack of knowledge around careers. We also note the challenges around the STEM field, and it's also framing around not allowing or not being representative entirely to everybody. But we then propose a solution where we try to say part of the problem is the issue of awareness and outreach. Are we getting there enough to try and understand what is happening on the ground and then proposing interventions that actually speak to how we address some of these challenges? So we were informed by the systems theory framework by Payton and McMahon, who have written greatly around the issues of career forming, particularly arguing that part of the enactment of career choice, it is as a result of a context, and a context which has inputs outputs, processes, and that interaction is what informs how career formation happens. We also borrowed from decision-making theory, which is the theory of planned behavior, because we are looking at intentions, and decisions form part of it. And in a nutshell, with the empirical literature, we note those gaps, particularly in those psycho variables, if you like, emotional intelligence, which we are starting to talk about, particularly in the era of the heightened awareness towards mental health development. We also note the importance of fusing also issues of personal interests and attitude, and how do they actually inform the stuff that we want to do in terms of understanding. So this was our model that we proposed, and in the model, what we sought to try and understand was how do those factors, the emotional intelligence, the interest, career interest, and the attitude form an appetite or an interest to join particularly the marine sciences. And remember the context I gave about the marine sciences that we introduced a little bit earlier on. And it was a quantitative study. We relied on 8 schools in Mdantsane. Those who know Mdantsane, one of the largest townships in the Eastern Cape and in the country basically. And what we basically tried to do, we used a career fair which was happening to try and get access to high school learners. We sought permission from the institution, our institution, and the representative institution. And though we used scales that have used predominantly in the research, measuring emotional intelligence, interest, and we confirmed the analysis through SPSS. And some of the findings that I'll take you through, it's a pity that we don't have time to go through in depth in all of them, but we had a fair balance between the representation in terms of gender, but like in most research of this nature, and it's also happening even in organizations, we find that female respondents respond more than the male respondents. Yeah, no fault of our own, but it's just the reality. Maybe we could talk about how do we control for that. But discussion for another day. And then we also tested for reliability with the instrument. It also passed issues of discriminant validity. And to take you through the findings, we found predominant support for all of the constructs that we had in view of what we were trying to measure. So for instance, we found that a student's or a learner's attention to emotional intelligence informed their intention of their career that they wanted to engage in. And I'll tell you some of the implications about that. We also found that emotional intelligence also related with interest and also attitudes, but importantly that interest actuated the interest in the marine sciences. Now, there were questions that we tried to ascertain from the learners around their awareness of the marine sciences. And thankfully, in some of the schools, there's been discussion about these types of careers in the marine sciences, and the Eastern Cape provincial government's effort of reaching out to the schools, particularly in understanding the importance of this sector. So what does this all mean? So one of the things that we are trying to propose is perhaps maybe in our schools and the teachers that are teaching these students, and particularly in issues of career education and outreach and awareness, that we need to also develop these, I don't like the way they usually use to say they are soft skills or soft issues. It kind of relegates it to say, oh, your emotional intelligence is soft. But for some people, that could be a strength in surviving, especially in a world full of uncertainties like the ones that we're seeing. So we're trying to encourage a battery to be created that assists in the development of aspects related to emotional intelligence. We also are interested in developing also issues around career interest. There needs to be more effort in conscientizing, especially in a province that is trying to carve out a niche in the area of the marine sciences. There needs to be a way of making sure that we make the teachers be aware, the learners be aware, and also the communities and the families be aware. In follow-up qualitative work we're doing, we are finding that one of the greatest deterrents to interest in some of these careers are the parents, because during their time they've never heard of the marine sciences. And this is where the whole framing of what the notion of a career is. So potentially, the marine sciences become an important profession in which one can enter, but the study kind of tells us what are some of the things we need to be doing. So in conclusion, teacher training in skills that promote aspects related to learner emotional intelligence, and it is not a soft skill. I actually think it's a hard skill that 15 years in the academy, I have learned that much of my staying power has not been drawn from the politicking around, but it's my emotional intelligence which is framed within the context that I'm in. We also want conducive environments in the schools that encourage that emotional intelligence or students to be aware of it, but also the development of attitudes and interests. And this is a concern because the schools that are able to afford the career counselors to get into the schools are the schools that are well-moneyed, the schools that are quite resourced. The under-resourced township schools struggle with that, and often relying on non-governmental work, people coming in to donate service or to offer their services. Let's integrate curriculum activity based on aspects that are found in the research, and I think this is the time, given the opportunity that we have to talk about aspects related to people's mental well-being and psychological well-being, to start fusing aspects related to emotional intelligence. Finally, to encourage continued participation in the sciences, particularly in the mind sciences, this conducive environment needs to be there, and we cannot emphasize it any less. It needs to be there because it creates this atmosphere and this appetite in which learners can not only learn about careers, but also make decisions in actually trying to combat the challenges of outreach and also education awareness, particularly in the career sciences, such as the marine sciences. Thank you.
How many was it?
It has two eyes.
I didn't see it.
So when your brain goes here, right? At the bottom, right?